So when I do the revolution, again, I'm always kind of I'm biased a little bit, you might say, when you think about as a Virginian, we have a lot of our history tied up in not only the American Revolution, but of course the American Civil War and other events like that. So I get really interested in the material for personal, and of course I got ancestors and a lot of ancestors in both wars. So I started out as a military historian. I started when I was at Virginia Tech. My research was in history, military history. Of course, when you start teaching in high school history, there's virtually no military part to it. So AP exam doesn't care that much about the military in terms of strategy or in terms of individual battles, the sort of mechanics of warfare. So we won't do a lot of that, but we will do some battles and of course some military leaders particularly. But I want to go in kind of the order of the book. So if you have your book, you know that the war is going to start during the Second Continental Congress's meeting. While the Second Continental Congress is going on, the Minutemen have fought. Now keep in mind, Boston and Philadelphia are quite a bit apart in distance. So up in Boston, you have sort of like a siege condition going on. The port of Boston is held by thousands of British soldiers and the British warships. They're now launching sort of punitive expeditions into the countryside, and that's where Lexington and Concord occurred. So, if you're in Philadelphia observing all this, it's a problem. It's a military problem now because the military of the British Empire is now fully availed, so to speak. So they debate, they go through a lot of arguing, and ultimately they agree to do a couple things. And it's sort of almost like a bipolar response. One pole, so to speak, is from the support of John Dickinson. This is the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer writer. He is going to mobilize support, particularly amongst Pennsylvania delegation to other places, to send what is called an olive branch. So olive branch is a metaphor for a peace dealer, an extension of wanting to make peace. The olive branch is in the claws or the mouth of a dove is a symbol of peace dating back to the Bible. But at the exact same time they do that, they make a huge decision as well, a momentous decision, and that is to choose one of their own member to take control over those Massachusetts soldiers, militiamen mostly, fighting. And that's this guy. He was a colonel at the time. He will, of course, be promoted to general. George Washington. And Washington is one of those great families from Virginia, those FBs. He had grown up in Virginia as a wealthy planter's son. His older brother had died in Barbados of smallpox. He also had contracted it and survived. And when his brother died, he inherited Mount Vernon, the estate. When he marries the wealthiest lady in Virginia at the time, Martha, she becomes, the combination of their two estates makes Washington the largest estate holder just about in America, one of the largest in Virginia, certainly. He was a slaveholder, although noted to be kind as a rule to his slaves. Most of the slaves that he owned were actually the possessions, if you're using that language, of his wife. He actually married and gained quite a bit of property. And really one of his most daunting frustrations is he wanted to be like a British manor lord. He rode to the hounds, he dressed in fine clothes, he owned a nice mansion, and frequently the cost of goods from Britain was prohibitive. And so he got very angry about, how expensive stuff was, he didn't like that. He didn't like having to pay a lot for gloves or a lot for clothing. So he would get upset with the British policy, the taxation policies. And during the Intolerable Acts and earlier acts, he spoke out against them in the House of Burgesses, among other things. Now, he was very much a dignified gentleman. In fact, the only major book that he kept by his bed beside the Bible was a rules of etiquette book, like how to behave like a proper gentleman. But he was also had experienced as a commander of soldiers, as a commander of troops. He led about 1,200 troops during the French and Indian War. He had experience as a military leader, but he was not a very good one. He didn't have very much success success as a military leader. He never really had won any major battles prior to this, and he wouldn't win many later. But his strength was in his charisma of being a strong, sort of silent type. He just sort of inspired loyalty, and people followed him. And so the selection of him was bright. It was a good idea by John Adams. John Adams said you had to have a Virginian at the head of this thing, and Franklin totally agreed with him, Benjamin Franklin. So when they nominated Washington, he was approved unanimously. And so during that year, the Brits are going to meet resistance led by George Washington. He's the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And in Cambridge is right outside of Boston. It's where Harvard is. And so he was there in charge of this sort of ragtag group of soldiers, so to speak. Now, that means we're going to be looking at today the first phase of the American Revolution, phase one. Technically, we had not declared our independence as a country, but we were fighting the Brits with to defend our liberties. That's why this very first action by the American military is kind of paradoxical, because we were fighting to defend ourselves and we invaded Canada. And so that's kind of like doesn't quite add up. But dating back to the success of the French and Indian War by attacking Quebec, the theory was if you want to beat Britain, you first got to like cut off this area up here, take this, and then you can close down the St. Lawrence River. So you're going to have a couple names emerge. Now keep in mind, here's Boston down here at the bottom, Lexington and Concord in the Massachusetts countryside. And the Brits are heavily ensconced here at this port. They've taken over Boston like completely. The Boston port is now like the Boston Navy. I mean, the British Navy are there. So what happens is you have a couple generals, and these are young generals. Washington is technically in charge, but Generals Montgomery, you can see his name here, and General Benedict Arnold. So you have Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold, who will march up these river basins, these riversides, and up Lake Champlain, and they're going to try to invade Canada. Well, it's so miserable for Benedict Arnold. His troops in Maine do so poorly, that he barely even makes it up here. They starve to death almost. They're eating shoe leather and horses, and it's cold. And so this is just a really not very effective. And their invasion of Canada would have ended in a complete failure had it not been for one battle in New York. Okay, so you do need to know this battle in New York. Now, it's not technically much of a battle. It's really more of a surprise capture. The first battle is actually going to take place down in Boston. You can see it here, the Battle of Bunker Hill. That's considered the first major battle of the American Revolution. But technically, there was a battle before it, and it's the Battle of what's called Fort Ticonderoga. I got these nice big names up in New York here. So here's Fort Ticonderoga. You can see it on Lake Champlain, Lake George below it. So it controls a crucial location to travel down the lake, and it's got a fortress on it. You can see here's the fort on this kind of crossroads here of the water where the Lake Champlain comes down. And so you see that this group called the Green Mountain Boys. So if you've ever, this new state called Vermont is going to emerge. Vermont means Green Mountain. And so you had a guy named Ethan Allen and another fellow, Benedict Arnold, are going to cross over Lake Champlain and capture the fort while the commander of the garrison is still asleep. But here you see Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold seizing Fort Ticonderoga, and they didn't even know they were under attack. The Brits had no idea the war had sort of started. So this was a surprise attack that is successful. Okay, so a couple hundred militiamen under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, the Green Mountain Boys are called, seize this fort. Okay, so they're very committed to the effort. And with that, perhaps most importantly, out of the fort are taken heavy cannons, like big artillery pieces. And those fort cannons are dragged down the river and down the lake all the way here to Boston. Okay, so they're going to be pulling these cannons all along here. And they're big cannons, Meanwhile, the Brits have decided to push the Patriots out of Boston altogether. And so they start an assault on an elevated hill. You can see the hill here. It's called Breed's Hill. Later on, the hill will be renamed Bunker Hill. But, over here, this is where the battle didn't take place. It's actually where the battle took place. But history's funny like that. So they're going to launch, General Howe a frontal assault, a large-scale frontal assault on this hill. And so this is the British strategy, like march up the hill and shoot the American patriots off the hill and game over. But as they attack, the American patriots create devastating losses on the British. They're absolutely gifted sharpshooters. They are like shooting Brit soldier after Brit soldier, shooting British officers in the eyes. And the British are falling down like dominoes. You're just getting slaughtered. All right. And it looks like the Brits are going to lose, but the American patriots run out of gunpowder and run out of musket fire bullets. And so they have to retreat, but not before the hill is sort of fought over at the very top of the hill. Here's a very famous painting of it. And you can see this is General Warren. Warren was John Adams' personal doctor. He was a friend of John Adams, and he dies at the Battle of Bunker Hill. His men will be bayoneted, and they will be stripped naked, and it will be just a really brutal act by the British. But the British fought what's sometimes called a Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhic means, if you fight a couple more wins like this, you're going to lose the war. They lost so many dudes that if battles are going to continue like this, the Brits can't win. 40% casualties. It's devastating. And they had underestimated the American patriot will to fight. So here you see a really blow to the Brits, but they do force the Patriots out of Boston. Okay. And here you see King George's response to this event. The authors and promoters of this desperate conspiracy, he's talking about the Patriots, meant to amuse by vague expressions of attachment. He's talking about the olive branch, vague expressions of attachment, and the strongest protestations of loyalty. He's saying, you guys are saying you're loyal to me, right? But you're in fact leading a revolt. How can you be loyal to me and leading a revolt? He says. The resolutions of Parliament are moderate and patient, right? They make up, conciliatory, accompanied by measures taken to enforce authority. I have acted with the same temper, anxious to prevent blood of my subjects and calamities from war. So King George is saying it's these traitorous leaders, just like we were talking about earlier, the Tory point of view. All right. This is how he sees this, not as the actions of a patriot, but as the actions of a traitor. Okay. But in Philadelphia, it's both this speech here and this action that raises real horror amongst the members of the Congress, because they're saying, well, not only is he butchering American patriots, he's saying that we're at war and that we're bad guys, and he's hiring German mercenaries to come fight. This isn't some family feud. He's hired 3,000 Germans to come shoot us. So by 1775, it seems clear to the Patriot leaders that there will be no kissing and making up after this summer of 1775. He sends German troops into Virginia, as well as British dragoons, these are guys on horseback, and they burn the city of Norfolk, or the town at the time of Norfolk, to the ground. So if you go back and look, now I will tell you this, Bunker Hill is a defeat for the American patriots. They have to give up the hill. But not long after it, those two cannons big cannons are going to show up from Ticonderoga, and George Washington's going to start bombarding the British in Boston. Okay, he's going to start bombing the harbor here. And the British are going to evacuate Boston and relocate to New York City, a much more amiable location in support of the revolution. That's why if you read your DBQ, you read about a small junto of people in New York. He's talking about loyalists to the British government in New York. So once Norfolk is burned, the question becomes now, can you convince the American people, the public, to support the revolution? And it is by no means a certainty that that's going to happen. And that enters one of the most famous immigrants in American history. The fellow's name is Thomas Paine, okay? He was a self-educated, mostly English immigrant. He's come over here, and he's looking at the circumstances of the, what's going on, and he believes that he needs to convince people of the value of fighting back against the British, okay? So he's going to author the most famous pamphlet in American history. And the title of the pamphlet is Common Sense. And what he means by that is, it is common sense for us to split from the British Empire. It is common sense. And then he gives common sense reasons. Now notice the date, right there at the same time as the burning of Norfolk. So he's trying to convince the American public, the sort of undecideds, why revolution is the right idea. Keep in mind, when you sell 120,000 copies in 1776, you're a bestseller. I want to make one other point right now and try to listen to this carefully. This document is an urge of the people of America to declare their independence. He's urging them to. The Declaration of Independence, which is also authored this year in July, is declaring their independence. So you need to understand the difference. Thomas Jefferson isn't trying to tell Americans we're getting our independence. He's declaring it. He's saying it's happened. Thomas Paine is trying to talk Americans into what Thomas Jefferson does later in the year. Now, Jefferson doesn't do it because Paine tells him to do it, but I will say this, Paine's influence is dramatic, both over the American public and the Continental Congress. So you should know the components of Thomas Paine's writing. First of all, he says it goes against the laws of nature for a tiny island to rule a huge continent. It just doesn't make sense. Where else in the heavens does a small body have a large body rotate around? You know, it's not how it works. Think scientific law, natural law, right? Like the way gravity works. Secondly, he said the king had squandered his right to be obeyed, that the king himself was a brute, that the king had violated what historians would call, and they would call, the social contract. King George has violated the social contract. He's broken the deal, the arrangement, by hiring Germans, by slaughtering colonists, by pushing unfair taxation. It violated our rights, and thus we had the right to separate from that. Okay, so we call this natural rights or natural law theory. And then thirdly, that America would be a role model for the rest of the world because we would stand up as a republic of virtue. We would be a place where people could say, oh, look at how virtuous, democratic, independent-minded Americans are, as opposed to selfish, sort of corrupted British governmental officials. So he's appealing to a host of things that normal people, and he writes it in a way that normal people can read. So that's important. You know, he puts it in everyday language. So Paine's Common Sense is a huge bestseller. And you got to figure if 120,000 people bought it, then at least twice that number read it, because that means people would share it with each other, right? So anywhere close to 250,000 people probably came in contact with this pamphlet personally. And here we see a statue of Paine, Paine up in Harvard, a big time hero. Pamphlet itself, pretty small, like I said, not big at all. Now, at the same month, around the springtime here, you have Virginia starting to act more aggressively. Virginia said, and this is not in your textbooks, you need to write this sort of somewhere else because sometimes the book doesn't get everything. Virginia has been debating if we declare independence, because they intend to, what should we have as a guarantee of government? And so keep in mind, this is the idea of being English subjects who have the history of the English Bill of Rights, but they're also products of the Enlightenment who understand concepts called natural rights. And perhaps one of the greatest scholars of that mentality here in Virginia was a guy named George Mason. You probably heard of the University of George Mason. And so George Mason is going to author in May something called the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is a precursor to the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Bill of Rights. All right, so important document right here in Virginia. And in it, you can read things like all men are free and independent, have certain rights. So Jefferson, when he's writing this is the same attitude shared by Mason earlier. Power comes from the people. John Locke talking here, Rousseau talking here, right? Montesquieu. No man is entitled to exclusive privileges or control of a community, okay? Then he's writing Montesquieu here. Legislative, executive, and judiciary should be separated. So know for knowledge sake, the Virginia Declaration of Rights in May. So we've got Paine's book coming out based on natural rights. We've got Mason's publication as the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Declaration of Rights, okay? And then you have Richard Henry Lee. Now, in May, the talk became very heated. Here you can see it's May down in Virginia. In May and June, at the Second Continental Congress is still in session. 1775, 1776. They have been debating, and at this point, John Adams wants to push for a Declaration of Independence. He wants to sever the ties. Sam Adams has wanted that from the beginning. Patrick Henry has wanted that from the beginning. John Adams was slow to get to it. Franklin was slow to get to it. But John Adams and Franklin both agree, Benjamin Franklin, agree that it should be Virginia that does this, that starts the independence. So the leader of the Virginia delegation, okay, again, name we've already covered, Richard Henry Lee. So an important Virginian. And he goes down to Virginia in June, actually in May when they're doing this. And then he gets permission from Virginia to author this resolution. The Virginia delegation's resolution. Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they're absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be dissolved. That's it. That's a Declaration of Independence. So Richard Henry Lee brings that back and issues it in June. Unfortunately, though, South Carolina and New York seem to not be in favor of it. And Franklin and Adams are very concerned that what happens if 6 of the colonies don't declare their independence, or 4? Then they will be disunited. And they don't want that. Or even 2. And so they talk to each other, and South Carolina, Mr. Rutledge asked, can he go back to South Carolina with the knowledge that this has been written and ask for permission to do this? Because he doesn't want to just do this without South Carolina's permission. New York, they're stuck because keep in mind, New York City is occupied by the British. They're loyalist. And so Mr. Duane, the representative from New York, he comes in and he says, I will abstain. I will not vote at all. South Carolina comes back and they say, we'll vote in favor. So on July 2nd, 1776, 12 of the 13 colonies vote yes on Richard Henry Lee's resolution. They vote for independence. John Adams, after the vote, celebrates. He's like, yay, July 2nd will be a day celebrated forever. It'll be a day that goes down in history with fireworks and celebration, July 2nd. Well, what's good note is that in June, John Adams had led a committee called the Committee of Five to write a resolution in support of Richard Henry Lee, a document supporting Richard Henry Lee's resolution, right? So it just so happens the guy who wrote it finishes on July the 4th. All right. And so rather than celebrating this event, the document that comes out from Thomas Jefferson is so astonishing. This is what people are going to sign on the 4th of July. And this is what we're going to celebrate. So we don't celebrate the resolution by Congress. We celebrate the declaration of the resolution in Congress. But Thomas Jefferson writes one of the greatest single documents the world has ever seen. Okay. And this is why he's picked. Again, Adams famously says, I have to have a Virginian at the head of this. You're a better writer than me, and you're way more likable than I am. So Jefferson begrudgingly accepts this. Jefferson at the time was writing the Constitution of Virginia. So, he was kind of busy, but he's like, yeah, I'll write this, in his spare time. And it is magnificent because he starts with a sort of like a summary of all these other Enlightenment thinkers. Okay. All people have natural rights. The rights he identifies as life. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, that change actually comes from Benjamin Franklin. Jefferson had written, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. But the word sacred means spiritual, religious. And Franklin said, we don't want to sound churchy. We want to sound secular. So we hold these truths to be obvious, right? Self-evident that all men are created equal. Created, yes, that's God, creator. But endowed, given by their creator, certain rights that can't be taken away, unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when Jefferson is quoting Locke here, he's saying these rights belong to all human beings, not just to Americans. And that's so valuable. Then he quotes Rousseau. All right, when a government abuses the rights, and Locke, we have a right to alter or abolish it. This is the kind of talk that Thomas Paine was making in January. Okay, this is the social contract 101. And then, like, 4/5 of the entire Declaration of Independence is spent listing what King George has done wrong. Now, Jefferson would know this because Jefferson has already written, back in the last chapter, the summary view of the rights of Virginia, right? So colonial Americans. So the summary view is a list of the things that were being denied. And then in closing, he restates this. He restates Lee's resolution, okay? But by doing this, he tells the colonists what our position is. And that makes you either be on the side of supporting the revolution or opposing it. He tells the British people, the Parliament, the King, everyone, what our position is. And he tells the world what our position is. Okay. And so here it is. Here's the document. It's in the National Archives. The original is still there. And this is the Committee of Five reduced to 3. So Jefferson writes it. And then there's a great scene in the movie John Adams that hopefully I can show you guys. But Franklin and Adams actually edit it. So they edit the original Declaration of Independence. So can you imagine, like, oh, let me take out my pen and edit this document. But that's what they do. And once this is out, there's no turning back. Okay. And so I want you to understand, here's the vote on the Declaration of Independence, the signers, okay? I want you to understand, though, that Jefferson's ideals that he represents are a product of many, many writers that had come before him in the previous 40 years. So he's writing John Locke, 1680s, okay? He's writing definitely Paine earlier in the year, but he's writing Voltaire, 1740s. He's writing Montesquieu. So all of these thinkers are in his mind when he sits down and writes the world's greatest paper, okay? But the key thing that you have to recognize, and this is the beauty of November the 3rd, it's coming up. If you're not happy with the government, not you guys, 18-year-olds and all that, but governments are created by men, not by God, right? Getting their authority, not divine right, deriving their power from the consent of the government. If it becomes destructive, is the right of the people to alter or abolish, right? It's a beautiful line. So come November the 3rd, if the American public are satisfied with the job President Trump and his administration are doing, then they can keep it. If they're not happy with it, they can make changes to it. And that's a magnificent thing, okay? And the reason we create government is to both protect our freedom, okay, and ensure our security. And that's the great balance of history. So this picture that we're going to close with is fanciful. It never happened this way. The Committee of Five did not present it to John Hancock like this. People came in and out all day long and signed the Declaration of Independence. So on July 4th, it was just sort of like they left the document sitting out and the signers came in and signed it. And that doesn't sound nearly as cool as having this sort of photo moment right here. But keep in mind, paintings typically don't show the events that really happen. So again, if you look at the actual declaration, I've cut it off there, but there are a lot of signers at the bottom. They strode in and out throughout that day of the 4th of July. And today we still celebrate, fireworks and cookouts and gatherings. So that's good news. Peace out.